The letter arrived on a Friday. This was not unusual. Letters arrived on Fridays the way they arrived on every other day. Through the slot in the door, onto the mat, into the ordinary archaeology of a morning. Yaa Mensah collected the post the way she collected everything that arrived in her life, with the efficient attention of a woman who had spent 44 years ensuring that nothing went unnoticed, and nothing went unmanaged, and nothing was allowed to become a problem through the simple negligence of not paying attention to it. She sorted the letters at the kitchen table. Bill. A catalog she had not requested and would not read. A card from her dentist reminding her of an appointment she had already written in her calendar. And a letter. A proper letter. Handwritten envelope. Her name and address in handwriting she recognized. Had been recognizing for 11 years. Had come to know as well as she knew certain faces. Had studied on so many envelopes that she could have reconstructed it from memory with reasonable accuracy. The handwriting of a woman named Adwoa, who had been dead for 11 years. Yaa sat down. She sat down because her legs had done something they had never done before. Not buckled, not failed, but decided independently that standing was no longer the appropriate position for whatever was about to happen. She looked at the envelope for a long time. The handwriting was Adwoa's. She was certain of this. She had 11 years of letters in a box under her bed, and she had read each one enough times to know the specific way Adwoa formed her letters. The particular curl of the capital Y, the way the A's were slightly wider than standard, the specific pressure of the pen on paper that gave the ink a quality that was unmistakably hers. But Adwoa had died 11 years ago. Yaa had been at the funeral. She had stood at the graveside in the January cold and had felt something leave the world that she had not been able to name at the time, and that she had spent 11 years understanding in increments. She turned the envelope over. There was a return address. It was not Adwoa's address. Not the house in Bristol where Adwoa had lived for the last 8 years of her life. The house Yaa had visited twice, the house where she had sat in the kitchen and drunk tea and talked for hours in the way that old friends talk when they have not seen each other for a while and are making up for the gap. The return address was different. A street she didn't recognize in a city she had not expected. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting continued, Adwoa's handwriting, or something so close to it that the difference, if there was one, was invisible to someone who had not known Adwoa personally, and therefore invisible to no one. She read the letter. Then she read it again. Then she put it down on the kitchen table and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something that requires perspective. The letter was not from Adwoa. It was from Adwoa's daughter. A daughter Yaa had not known existed. A daughter who had spent 11 years writing back. Yaa Mensah and Adwoa had been friends for 31 years. They had met at 22 at a teacher training college in the Midlands. 2 Ghanaian women in a cohort that was not, in 1992, as diverse as it would later become, which had created between them an initial proximity that had very quickly revealed itself to be something more than circumstantial. They had discovered, over the first weeks, that they were not friends because they were both Ghanaian and both training to teach and both slightly isolated in a cohort that did not always know how to include them. They were friends because of the specific unplannable chemistry of 2 people whose minds worked in complementary ways. Adwoa precise and analytical, Yaa intuitive and expansive, each one finding in the other the quality their own thinking most lacked. They had taught in different cities after qualifying, Yaa in London, Adwoa in various locations that had eventually settled into Bristol. They had maintained the friendship the way long-distance friendships are maintained, which is to say imperfectly and with great effort, and with the periodic understanding that imperfect and effortful is still infinitely better than the alternative. They had called. They had visited. They had, in the years before communication became instant and frictionless, and therefore somehow less meaningful, written letters. This was the thing Yaa had never let go of even as the world moved away from it. She had continued writing letters to Adwoa long after email made letters unnecessary and WhatsApp made email feel formal. She had written because she found in the letter a quality of attention that other forms of communication didn't produce. The sitting down, the pen in hand, the deliberate construction of thought into sentences that would travel from her to someone else on paper, carrying the pressure of her handwriting and the particular organization of her mind on that particular day. Adwoa had written back. Always. Promptly, in her precise analytical way, with the complete sentences of someone who had spent 30 years teaching children that complete sentences were a form of respect for the reader. They had written to each other for 20 years. And then Adwoa had died. The death had been sudden. A brain aneurysm. The kind that arrives without warning and without negotiation, that does not offer the opportunity of preparation or farewell. Adwoa had been at school, in her classroom, marking books at the end of a Tuesday afternoon, and she had simply gone. The teaching assistant who found her had said she looked peaceful, which Yaa had accepted with the understanding that this was something people said, and that its truth was not really the point. Yaa had been devastated in the specific way of someone who loses a friendship that was one of the organizing structures of their interior life. Not a marriage, not a family member. The grief for those losses had their established language, their recognized weight. The grief for a friendship of 31 years was quieter, less legible to the outside world, less accommodated by the social architecture of mourning. People said they were sorry and moved on in the way that people move on when they believe the loss is of a certain scale and no larger. Only Yaa knew the scale. She had gone to the funeral, had stood at the graveside, had gone back to London and had sat in her flat and had felt the particular silence of a world from which a specific voice had been removed. 3 weeks after the funeral, she had sat at her kitchen table and written a letter. She had not made a conscious decision to do this. She had simply found herself there, pen in hand, paper in front of her, beginning the way she had always begun. Dear Adwoa. She had written for 40 minutes. She had written about the funeral and the cold and the too many people in a too small space and the specific inadequacy of sandwiches as a response to grief. She had written about Adwoa's classroom, which someone had described to her, and that she had been able to picture completely from Adwoa's descriptions over the years. She had written about the 31 years and what they had contained. She had addressed the envelope. She had used the Bristol address, Adwoa's address, the house that presumably now belonged to someone else or to Adwoa's estate or simply stood empty in the January cold with Adwoa's books still on the shelves. She had posted it. She had told herself this was a form of processing, a grief ritual. The letter would arrive at an empty house or be returned to sender, and she would feel whatever she felt, and that would be the end of it. The letter was not returned. 6 weeks later, a reply arrived. The reply was in Adwoa's handwriting. Or what Yaa believed, for the duration of a very long moment, was Adwoa's handwriting. She had stood in her hallway holding the envelope and felt the world do something it should not be able to do. Offer her something she had understood was permanently unavailable. She had opened it with hands that were not steady. The letter inside was brief. It explained that the writer was Adwoa's daughter, Adwoa, 23 years old, who had moved into her mother's house after the funeral to manage the estate. That she had found Yaa's letter on the mat and had read it. She apologized for this, though it seemed to her, she wrote, that a letter written to her mother deserved to be read by someone who loved her mother, which she hoped Yaa would understand and forgive. That reading it had broken something open in her that had been sealed since the funeral. That she hoped it was not presumptuous to write back. That she had her mother's handwriting, she knew this, had been told it her whole life. And she understood if seeing it on the envelope was painful and if Yaa would prefer not to hear from her again. That her mother had spoken of Yaa often. That she felt, reading Yaa's letter, that she knew her already. That she hoped this was not strange to say. Yaa had sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then she had written back. Adwoa Boateng had been born when her mother was 34. Later than Adwoa had planned, she had told Yaa at the time, though whether the plan had ever been concrete or simply an intention held loosely was not something Yaa had thought to ask. She had known about Adwoa. She had heard about her for 23 years. The child who was serious from birth, who had her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness and who had, according to Adwoa's letters, opinions about things that were disproportionate to her age and completely accurate. She had seen photographs, the school photograph every year, the occasional snapshot from a birthday or a holiday, a particularly good one from a beach somewhere that showed Adwoa at about 14 making a face at the camera that was so exactly like something Adwoa would have done at that age that Yaa had laughed out loud at her kitchen table. But she had never met her. The twice she had visited Bristol, Adwoa had been elsewhere, once at her father's, once on a school trip. Adwoa had always said they should fix this, should arrange a visit where they would all be present, and they had always said yes absolutely and had never quite gotten around to it. And then Adwoa had died and the arranging was permanently off the table. Or so Yaa had believed. The correspondence between Yaa and Adwoa developed with the slow, careful quality of something building on a foundation that was substantial but unfamiliar. The foundation of Adwoa, of 31 years of a friendship that had contained Akojua as a subject without ever containing her as a participant. Akojua wrote the way her mother wrote. Not identically, the precision was there, but the register was different, younger, with a directness that was less mediated than Adwoa's had been. She asked questions. Real ones, specific ones, the questions of someone who wants to know rather than someone who is performing wanting to know. She asked what her mother had been like at 22. She asked about the teacher training college and the cohort and the particular dynamic that had produced a friendship between two women who would go on to live in different cities for the next 30 years and yet remained close. She asked about the letters, what her mother wrote about in the letters, what the letters sounded like, whether Yaa had kept them. Yaa had kept them. She described them. The precise analytical sentences. The complete paragraphs. The specific way Adwoa had of beginning a subject at the side rather than head-on, approaching the important thing from an angle until she had enough traction to address it directly. The humor that appeared rarely and without warning, and that was, when it came, devastating. Akojua had written back, "That is exactly her. That is exactly what she was like at the kitchen table. I have been trying to describe it to people since she died, and I have not been able to find those words. Thank you." Yaa had read that sentence and felt something move through her that she had not felt since the graveside in January 3 years before. The specific grief of the accurately described, of the person who is gone being made present for a moment through the act of someone who loved them finding the right words. Akojua told her own story in increments, the way people tell things in letters. Not all at once, not as a presentation, but emerging over months of correspondence as something that was simply the truth of her life being shared with someone she was coming to trust. She was 23 when the correspondence began and 34 when Yaa received the letter on the Friday morning that began this story. She had spent 11 years living with her mother's absence in the specific way of a daughter who loses her mother young. Incompletely, with the ongoing awareness of all the things that would now not be witnessed and not be shared and not be available for consultation. She had completed a degree in education, her mother's field, which had not been a plan but had turned out to be where she belonged, in the way that certain inheritances reveal themselves as belonging rather than obligation. She had taught in Bristol for 4 years, had moved to a school in another city, had been promoted, had built a professional life that was her own and that her mother would have understood. She had 3 years ago had a daughter. She had named her Adwoa. She had written to Yaa about the naming with the care of someone who understood that this information would carry weight and wanted to give it the space it deserved. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Yaa had read it at her kitchen table and had needed to stop in the middle and look out the window for a while before she could continue. "I want her to know who she is named for," Akojua had written. "Not just as a biographical fact, but as a living thing. I want her to understand the kind of person her grandmother was. Specific details, specific stories, the things that make a person real rather than legendary. I have been trying to collect these things. Your letters have given me more of them than anything else. I think you knew my mother in a way that I could not, at 23, have fully seen. I think you saw her as a whole person in a way that children cannot always see their parents. I am grateful for that. I am grateful for all of it." Yaa discovered the full truth of what had been happening on a Sunday afternoon in October when she was going through the box under her bed. The box that contained the letters. Not just the new ones, the ones from Akojua, which she kept separately in a folder, organized by year. But the original letters, Adwoa's letters, the 20 years of correspondence from Bristol that she had carried from flat to flat and house to house for 30 years, and that she had never been able to consider getting rid of, because they were, in a very real sense, 30 years of her friend's mind preserved on paper. She had been going through the box because Akojua had written asking whether Yaa might be willing to share some of the letters with her, to read them, to have copies made. Not all of them. She understood they were private, understood that a 31-year friendship contained things that were not meant for a daughter's eyes. But some. The ones that might help her understand who her mother had been before she was a mother. Yaa had been going through the box to identify which letters might be appropriate to share. She had found the letter at the bottom of the box. It was from Adwoa, clearly from Adwoa, the handwriting immediately recognizable, the Bristol postmark, her name and address on the back. Posted, according to the postmark, 2 weeks before Adwoa died. Yaa had never received it. She did not know how it had ended up at the bottom of the box. The only explanation she could reconstruct was that it had arrived during a period when she had been away, a 2-week trip to visit family that she had taken in early January, the January of Adwoa's death, and had been collected on her return along with 2 weeks of other post, and had been placed in the box with the other letters without being opened. She had not opened it because she had not known it was there. She had gone to Adwoa's funeral 10 days after returning from the trip. She had never opened this letter. She opened it now. The letter was 6 pages. The longest letter Adwoa had written in the 31 years of their correspondence. Yaa read it in the October afternoon light with the box of letters open on the bed beside her, and the 11 years of Akojua's letters in their folder on the desk, and the full strange weight of everything she was only now understanding pressing down on the ordinary Sunday of her life. The letter was extraordinary. Not in what it said, which was not confessional, not dramatic, not the letter of someone who knew they were about to die and was making a final accounting. Adwoa had not known she was about to die. The letter was ordinary in the way of the best Adwoa letters. Precise, complete, moving from one subject to another with the unhurried intelligence of someone who had something real to say and was taking the time to say it properly. But the subjects. The letter talked about Akojua. At length, in detail, with the specific combination of pride and anxiety and bafflement and complete love that parents bring to the discussion of their adult children. Akojua was 23 at the time, had just completed her degree, was beginning to become fully herself in ways that Adwoa found thrilling and occasionally terrifying. She is so much herself, Adwoa had written. I watch her and I think, where did that come from? And then I think, from everywhere. From her father. From me. From the specific combination of everything that went into making her and the specific choices she has made with what she was given. She is becoming someone I am proud to know, not just proud to have made. You understand the difference. You always understood these things. She had written about a conversation with Akojua the week before. An argument, really, about something Yaa could not fully reconstruct from the account, but whose resolution had clearly moved Adwoa. She said something that I have been turning over all week, she wrote. She said that the thing she wanted most was for me to talk to her, like she was a person I respected, rather than a person I was responsible for. And I realized, I have not always done that. I have loved her completely and respected her completely, but I have not always communicated the respect in the way she needed to receive it. She is teaching me things. At 23. I find this extraordinary. She had written about Yaa herself. About the friendship. About what 31 years of it had meant, and what it had given her, and what she thought it had given Yaa, and what she hoped it would continue to give both of them. I have been thinking, she wrote, about what it means to be known by someone. Really known. Not the version of yourself you present to the world. Not the professional self, or the social self, or even the family self. But the actual self. The one that exists in the letters. You know that self of mine. I think you know it better than anyone. I want you to know that I understand the weight of that, and I am grateful for it every day. I should say this more often. I am saying it now. The letter ended with the practicalities that Adwoa always ended with. Questions about Yaa's life, her work, her family, the small specific inquiries of a friend who paid attention. An instruction to write back soon. A sign-off that was warm and characteristic and completely itself. Yaa held the 6 pages for a long time. Then she put them down. Then she picked them up again. She thought about 11 years of letters from Akojua arriving at her door in an envelope addressed in handwriting so close to her mother's that Yaa had, every time, in the first second, felt her heart do something before her brain caught up. She thought about what Akojua had said in one of her early letters. I have her handwriting. I have always been told this. I hope it is not painful to see it on the envelope. She thought about the unopened letter at the bottom of the box. The last thing Adwoa had ever written to her. Arriving 11 years late. On a Sunday afternoon in October. When she was finally ready to find it. She called Akojua that evening. Not a letter. This required a voice, required the immediate, required the particular courage of saying something out loud rather than through the measured safety of ink on paper. She found Akojua's number in the folder. She had it, had always had it, had never used it in 11 years of correspondence because the letters had always felt like the right form and neither of them had suggested changing it. Akojua answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was her mother's voice. Not exactly. Different in the register, younger, with an accent that had more Bristol in it than her mother's had had. But the quality of it. The precise attention in the way she said hello. Yaa told her about the letter. She told her as simply as she could manage, which was not very simply because the simplest possible version was, Your mother wrote me a letter 2 weeks before she died, and I found it 11 years later at the bottom of a box, and I am calling you because you need to know what it says." Akosua was quiet for a moment when Yaa finished. Then she said, "Can you read it to me?" Yaa read it to her. All 6 pages. In the quiet of her flat on a Sunday evening in October, with the folder of 11 years of Akosua's letters on the desk and the box of Adwoa's letters on the bed and the one letter in her hand, she read her dead friend's last words to her dead friend's daughter. When she finished, there was a long silence. "She taught you things," Akosua said finally. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone doing significant work on the inside. "That's what you said in your first letter. That she taught you things about being a friend." "Yes," Yaa said. "She said the same about you," Akosua said. "In the letter. She said you understood things that she didn't have to explain." "Yes. I want to meet you," Akosua said. "I have wanted to meet you for 11 years. I think I was afraid to suggest it. I think I was afraid that meeting you would make the letters into something different, and I didn't want the letters to be different." "I understand that," Yaa said. "Because she did. Because she had felt the same thing. I think," Akosua said carefully, "that I also felt that meeting you was something my mother should have arranged. That it was her introduction to make. And she didn't get to make it." "No," Yaa said. "But she made it anyway," Akosua said. "With the letters. She just didn't know she was doing it." Yaa thought about this. She thought about 31 years of letters in a box. About 11 years of letters in a folder. About the letter at the bottom of the box. About the specific, improbable, completely characteristic way that Adwoa Boateng had managed, from beyond any possible intention, to introduce her daughter to her oldest friend through the mechanism of her own handwriting surviving her. "When can you come?" Yaa asked. Akosua came on a Saturday in November. She arrived at Yaa's door at 11 in the morning with a small bag over one shoulder and a photograph in her hand, held out immediately, before the greetings were fully completed, with the directness that Yaa recognized from the letters. The photograph showed Adwoa at 22. Yaa had never seen this photograph. It was clearly from a period before they met. Adwoa looked almost recognizable, her face slightly less formed, the precision of her expression not yet fully present, but beginning to be visible. "I found it going through her things," Akosua said. "I thought you should have it." Yaa looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Akosua. She had her mother's face in the specific way of people who have inherited the architecture of a parent's face, but are building something different on it. The same jaw, the same careful eyes, the same quality of attention, the sense of someone who was fully present to whatever was in front of them and was not performing that presence. "Come in," Yaa said. "I've made too much food." Akosua came in. The day was long and full and had the quality of time that refuses to move at its usual pace. Not slowly, but differently, as if the hours understood that what was happening in this flat required more than their standard allocation. They talked about Adwoa. Of course they talked about Adwoa. She was the reason for everything, the foundation of the entire structure. But they talked about her in the way that people talk about someone who was real and complicated and not always easy and deeply loved. Not hagiography, not the managed version of a person preserved in amber by grief. The real version. The full version. Akosua told Yaa things she had not known. The stubbornness at home, not the professional precision but the domestic stubbornness. The difficulty of being her daughter when her daughter had opinions that conflicted with her own and Adwoa had not yet learned the lesson she described in the last letter. The argument they had had the week before she died. The one from the letter, the one about respect versus responsibility, and what it had felt like to have that as the last significant conversation. "We made up," Akosua said. "I want you to know that. Before, we had spoken on the phone 2 days before, and we were fine. The argument was resolved. But the argument was also the last real conversation we had. And I have spent 11 years with that." "What do you do with it?" Yaa asked. "I teach," Akosua said simply. "I teach, and I try to talk to the people I'm teaching the way my mother eventually learned to talk to me. Like they're people I respect. Not people I am responsible for." Yaa looked at her. "She would be proud of you," she said. "I know," Akosua said. Not with arrogance, with the specific, quiet certainty of someone who has done the work of knowing something difficult. "I know she would. I have known it for a few years now. It took a while to get there. Your letters helped." Yaa showed her the box. She had wondered whether to, had considered it, had gone back and forth, had ultimately understood that the box was the whole point. that the box was the physical archive of the friendship that had produced everything that followed. That Akosua had as much right to it as anyone. They went through it together, slowly, at the kitchen table, with tea that was replaced twice because time passed in the way it passes when you are doing something that matters. Yaa read sections out loud when Akosua asked. Akosua held letters she could not read without stopping. Would stop, would look at the ceiling briefly, would continue. At some point Akosua found a letter that made her laugh. A loud, sudden, completely genuine laugh. The kind that arrives without preparation and means exactly what it says. What? Yaa said. Akosua read her the relevant section. Adwoa's precise analytical account of a situation at school that was, in the telling, genuinely funny, the humor arriving without announcement in the middle of what was ostensibly a serious professional complaint. Yaa laughed. The laughter filled the kitchen. It was her friend's humor, delivered through her friend's daughter, in the handwriting that was both of them and neither of them. In a kitchen where Adwoa had never been, and where her presence was, on this particular Saturday in November, more fully felt than it had been anywhere since the graveside in January 11 years ago. Before Akosua left, she took out her phone and showed Yaa a photograph. A small person. Dark eyes. Serious expression. Adwoa, Akosua said. The child looked up at the camera with an expression of complete, focused attention that was immediately and unmistakably familiar. She has her grandmother's face, Yaa said. Yes, Akosua said. She has her grandmother's everything. The precision. The opinions. The complete inability to leave a question unanswered. She paused. I want her to know about the letters. When she's old enough. I want her to understand what a friendship looks like over 30 years. What it takes. What it gives. Bring her, Yaa said. When she's ready. Bring her here. Akosua looked at her. We will, she said. The box is still under the bed. It contains more now than it did. The 30 years of Adwoa's letters, the 11 years of Akosua's letters, and the one letter that arrived 11 years late and changed the understanding of everything that had come after it. Yaa still writes letters. She writes to Akosua, less frequently than before, because they have phone calls now and occasional visits and a Saturday in November that opens something that has not closed. But still, the letters continue because some things need the sitting down and the pen in hand and the deliberate construction of thought into sentences that will travel from one person to another on paper. She has begun writing to Adwoa the child. Not the grandmother, the child. 3 years old, serious-eyed, possessed of opinions disproportionate to her age. She has begun writing letters that she knows will not be read for years, that Akosua is keeping for her, adding them to a box of their own, a box that will be given to the child when she is old enough. The letters talk about her grandmother, about 31 years of a friendship, about what that friendship looked like from the inside, the ordinary miracle of two people paying attention to each other across 30 years and 400 miles and every obstacle that life placed between them. About the letters, about what letters are for. A letter is a thought that has been made real, she wrote in the first one. Your grandmother understood this. I understand it because of her. When you are old enough to read this, you will understand it because of both of us. We're giving you something that takes a long time to give. That is the point. Some things take a long time. The ones that take the longest are usually the ones most worth having. She sealed the envelope. She addressed it. Adwoa Boateng. To be opened when ready. She placed it in the box. She went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table where she had been sitting for 11 years writing letters to a woman who had been dead and receiving letters back from a woman who was very much alive and who had her mother's handwriting and her mother's face and her mother's precise, complete, devastating attention. She thought about the letter at the bottom of the box, the one that had been waiting 11 years to be found. She thought about Adwoa writing it 2 weeks before she died, sitting at the kitchen table in the Bristol house, in the ordinary way of someone writing an ordinary letter, not knowing it was the last one. Writing about Akosua and about the friendship, and about being known, and about saying things that should be said more often. I should say this more often. I am saying it now. Yaa looked at the box on the shelf where she had moved it, no longer under the bed, brought out into the room, where it could be seen. She picked up her pen. She began. Dear Akosua,